Arthur Vance felt the weight of 62 years not in his joints, which were kept limber by private trainers and year-round tennis, but in the profound, crushing inertia of his own life. He sat in a leather chair softer than most people's beds, in an office 48 floors above the Philadelphia skyline, and stared at a spreadsheet. The numbers, usually a source of crisp, clean satisfaction, were a blurry testament to his own obsolescence. They represented the slow, dignified decay of the Gilded Cage, the flagship restaurant of his very first hotel, the Sterling Philadelphia. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a creator of worlds. Vance Hospitality Group was an empire of bespoke experiences, a collection of over 100 luxury hotels and resorts that dotted the globe like jewels. He had built it all from a single inherited property his father had run into the ground. Arthur had resurrected it, polished it, and used it as the cornerstone for everything that followed. The Sterling Philadelphia, and by extension the Gilded Cage, was his genesis. And now it was failing. Not failing in a way that would make headlines. The decline was subtle, a slow bleed. Occupancy rates were down a few points. Restaurant revenues had slid for 8 consecutive quarters. Customer reviews spoke of a place that was tired, overpriced, and coasting on a reputation from a bygone era. His COO, a sharp, relentlessly efficient man named Marcus Thorne, had presented a dozen solutions: a celebrity chef buyout, a multi-million-dollar renovation, a complete rebranding. Arthur had looked at the glossy presentations and felt nothing. They were sterile solutions for a problem he felt in his gut was one of the soul. "It's rot, Marcus," he'd said, tossing a 50-page proposal onto his marble desk. "You can't fix rot by slapping on a new coat of paint. You have to find the source and cut it out." "The source is a changing market, Arthur," Marcus had argued, his tone patient but strained. "We're competing with chic, minimalist pop-ups. The Gilded Cage is an institution, but institutions become mausoleums if they don't adapt." Arthur shook his head. "The institution is sound. The foundation is strong. Something is wrong inside. Something human." And so the plan was born, a plan so anachronistic and absurd that Marcus had nearly laughed before realizing his boss was deadly serious. Arthur Vance, the man whose face was a semi-regular feature in financial magazines, was going to go undercover. Not as a guest, but as an employee. He would become Art V-Neck, a man his age with a fabricated history of failed small businesses, a man desperate enough to take the lowest job on the totem pole, a busboy at the Gilded Cage. He spent a week crafting the persona. He bought worn work pants and non-slip shoes from a discount store, the synthetic fabric feeling alien and insulting against his skin. He let his silver hair grow a little shaggy and stopped shaving, the resulting salt and pepper stubble making him look less like a captain of industry and more like a man who had lost his ship. He traded his Audemars Piguet for a cheap digital watch and practiced a slight slump, a physical manifestation of defeat that felt surprisingly easy to adopt. The hardest part was the hands. His hands were smooth, the nails impeccably cared for. He spent an afternoon working in the neglected garden of his mainline estate without gloves, welcoming the feel of dirt and the beginnings of a callus. He rented a drab, dented sedan and drove himself to the Sterling, parking not in the private executive garage, but 3 blocks away in a public lot that smelled of urine and despair. As he walked toward the grand entrance, he felt a strange thrill mixed with a potent dose of shame. He was a king entering his castle through the servant's door, and no one would even know to bow. The staff entrance was a dented steel door in a grimy back alley, propped open with a broken brick. The moment he stepped inside, the carefully climate-controlled air of the hotel lobby was replaced by a humid wave of clashing smells. Bleach, old grease, roasting garlic, and the faint, sweet scent of decay from the overflowing dumpsters outside. This was the engine room of his empire, and it was loud, hot, and forgotten. The man who interviewed him was the restaurant's general manager, Julian Croft. Arthur knew him from a file. 45 years old, impeccably dressed, with a resume full of glowing reviews from his previous positions. On paper, he was a star. In person, he exuded a slick, predatory charm. His smile was wide and white, but it never touched his cold, calculating eyes. "Art, is it?" Julian said, barely glancing at the fake resume Arthur had handed him. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a manicured finger on his desk. The office was small and cluttered, a stark contrast to the opulent dining room just beyond the door. "Says here you ran a catering business. Went under?" "Market changed," Arthur mumbled, pitching his voice lower, adding a gravelly note of resignation. "Couldn't keep up." "The world is a tough place for the little guy," Julian said, the sympathy in his voice as artificial as the silk plant in the corner. "The work here is demanding, long hours, not much glory. You're clearing plates, resetting tables, basically being invisible. Think you can handle that at your age?" The question was a perfectly crafted insult, wrapped in the guise of professional concern. "I'm a hard worker," Arthur said, his jaw tightening. Julian smirked. "We'll see. Minimum wage, plus a small tip out from the servers, assuming you don't break anything. You start tomorrow, 6 p.m. sharp. Don't be late, and get a haircut. You look like you've been sleeping in your car." Arthur nodded, the anger a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He could have fired this man with a single, whispered word into his phone. He could have bought the building Julian lived in and had it condemned. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for the opportunity." As he was leaving, Julian called out, "Oh, and Art, the first rule of the Gilded Cage, the guest is God. The second rule, I am his prophet. Remember that." Arthur walked out into the alley, the manager's smug laughter echoing in his ears. He had expected to find inefficiency, apathy, maybe a bit of petty theft. He had not expected to find a man who radiated such casual, confident cruelty. The rot, he suspected, had a name, and its name was Julian. He spent the rest of the day in his sterile rental apartment, the silence amplifying his unease. He had built this empire to be a monument to excellence, to service, to a standard of quality that was uncompromising. He had always believed that if you built a perfect system, the right people would flourish within it. He was beginning to fear that his perfect system had become a perfect hiding place for monsters. He had come looking for a problem with his business. He was starting to realize the problem might be with his soul. The first shift was a lesson in organized chaos and ritualized humiliation. The kitchen was a pressure cooker of heat, noise, and sharp tempers. The head chef, a man named Antoine who ruled his domain with a terrifying French accent and a penchant for throwing tongs, seemed to hold a special disdain for the new, old busboy. Arthur, as Art, was intentionally clumsy. He fumbled with the heavy trays, stacked plates unevenly, and couldn't master the precise, balletic dance of weaving between servers in the narrow corridors. "Imbecile!" Antoine screamed when Arthur nearly dropped a tray of dirty dishes. "Do you have butter for fingers? Move!" He spent hours in the dish pit, a steamy, deafening corner of hell where a hulking machine blasted plates with scalding water. The humidity was suffocating, and the stench of half-eaten gourmet food turning to garbage was nauseating. His back, accustomed to the ergonomic perfection of his office chair, began to scream in protest. His expensive, handmade shoes, traded for cheap rubber clogs, felt like instruments of torture. This was the reality for the people who made his dream a reality, and he had been utterly, willfully blind to it. It was during his third hour, as he was struggling to load a bus tub that felt like it was filled with lead, that he first truly noticed her. Her name was Clara. She was a waitress, young, maybe 23 or 24, with serious, intelligent eyes and brown hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. She moved with a preternatural grace, a silent efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy around her. She didn't rush. She simply flowed, anticipating needs, appearing with a water refill a moment before a guest had to ask, clearing a plate with a movement so swift and silent it was barely noticed. But there was something else about her, attention, a carefully guarded stillness. She always wore the long-sleeve version of the uniform, the starched white cuffs buttoned securely at her wrists, even when the dining room was warm and the other servers had their sleeves rolled up. And he saw it then, a subtle, almost imperceptible favoring of her left arm. When she carried a heavy tray, she bore the weight primarily on her right. When she set a table, her left hand moved with a stiff, deliberate precision, as if it were a tool she didn't fully trust. Later, during a rare lull, he saw her standing in the dim light of the service corridor, leaning against a wall. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of exhaustion. With her right hand, she was gently, almost unconsciously, massaging her left forearm, a flicker of deep, resonant pain crossing her features before she smoothed it away as another server approached. Arthur watched her, his own aches and pains fading into insignificance. He saw the way Julian Croft watched her too. The manager's eyes would linger on her, his gaze a mixture of appraisal and predatory ownership. He never spoke to her with the open contempt he used for others. His cruelty toward her was more insidious. "Clara, darling," he'd purr, gliding up to her at the service station. Table 7 mentioned their wine wasn't chilled to precisely 58 degrees. "You know how Mr. Henderson likes it. Let's be a little more proactive, shall we? We want to earn that generous tip, don't we?" He would deliver the rebuke with a dazzling smile, making it sound like a helpful suggestion, but the undertone of threat was unmistakable. Clara would just nod, her face impassive. "Yes, Julian, of course." Arthur learned more from the whispers of the other staff members during stolen moments by the loading dock. He learned that Clara was the best server they had, the one who handled the most difficult VIPs, the one who never complained. He also learned that she never, ever took a day off. "Girl works 6 days a week, double shifts on weekends," a weary-looking bartender named Sal told him, lighting a cigarette in the alley. "Never seen anything like it. Julian works her like a rented mule, but she just keeps her head down and does the job." "Why?" Arthur asked, trying to sound casual. Sal shrugged, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Got her reasons, I guess. We all do." The first real crack in Clara's composure came on a Tuesday night. The restaurant was moderately busy. A party of 6 at a corner table was being particularly demanding, sending back dishes, complaining about the music, and generally making a nuisance of themselves. Clara was handling them with her usual unflappable grace. Arthur was clearing a nearby table when he saw it happen. The man at the head of the table, florid and loud, was gesturing expansively with a steak knife as he told a story. Clara leaned in to refill his water glass, and his hand movement caught her off guard. The back of his hand, holding the knife, struck the heavy glass pitcher she was holding. The pitcher slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the table. Ice and water sluiced across the polished wood, soaking the man's expensive suit and splashing onto the woman beside him. A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. Clara froze, her face draining of all color. "I am so sorry, sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Before she could continue, Julian was there, appearing as if from thin air. His face was a mask of theatrical concern. He placed a proprietary hand on Clara's shoulder, his fingers digging in just a little too hard. "An unforgivable lapse in concentration," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk, but carrying a clear undercurrent of menace directed at Clara. He turned his brilliant smile on the wet, sputtering guest. "Sir, madam, my deepest apologies. Your entire meal, of course, is on the house, and we'll have our in-house concierge arrange for the immediate dry cleaning of your suit, with our compliments." He then turned to Clara, his smile tightening. "Clara, go to my office. Now!" She fled, her face a mask of utter humiliation. Arthur watched her go, a cold fury building inside him. He knew what he had seen. It was the guest's fault, not hers. But Julian had used the moment to assert his dominance, to reinforce her precarious position. Arthur finished clearing his tables, his movements stiff with rage. He needed to know what was happening in that office. He loaded his bus tub and headed toward the back, his path taking him past the manager's office. The door was closed, but the walls were thin. He paused, pretending to adjust the stacks of plates in his tub. He couldn't hear Julian's words, only the low, venomous murmur of his voice. But he could hear Clara's response, clear as a bell. "It won't happen again, Julian, I promise." Her voice was tight, strained, stripped of all its professional calm. "It better not," Julian's voice rose slightly. "You know what's at stake. You need this job. You need the tips from the VIP tables I give you, don't you?" There was a pause, then quieter, more desperate. "Yes, you know I do." "Good. Now the cost of the meal I just comped and the dry cleaning will be coming out of your tips for the week. We'll call it a clumsiness tax, a reminder to be more careful. Arthur felt the rage flash hot in his chest. It was theft, pure and simple. He wanted to kick the door in. He wanted to grab Julian by his ridiculously expensive tie and introduce him to the grimy floor of the alley. But he couldn't. To do so would be to destroy the entire investigation. He forced himself to move on, the weight of the dishes in his hands feeling insignificant compared to the weight of his own impotence. Later that night, as they were closing, he found Clara in the server's station, meticulously polishing silverware. Her movements were jerky, angry. There were faint, shimmering tracks of tears on her cheeks, hastily wiped away. He approached cautiously. "That was a raw deal tonight," he said quietly. "It wasn't your fault." She didn't look up from her work, her knuckles white as she rubbed a fork with a ferocity it didn't deserve. "Doesn't matter whose fault it was." "He can't just take your tips like that," Arthur pressed gently. "That's illegal." She finally looked up and her eyes were filled with a weary, bitter fire that startled him. "And who's going to stop him? You? The law? The law doesn't pay for my grandmother's care facility. The law doesn't understand that if I lose this job, she ends up in a state-run home where they'll forget she exists." She spat the words out, each one a shard of glass. "So you can take your righteousness and file it away, Art. Some of us don't have the luxury of being right. We just have the necessity of surviving." She threw the fork down, the clatter echoing in the silent dining room. She grabbed her bag and walked out, leaving Arthur standing alone amidst the ghosts of the evening's opulent meals. Her grandmother's care facility. The pieces began to click into place. The desperation, the refusal to take a day off, the fear of Julian. It wasn't just about a job. It was about a lifeline. He had come here to find a flaw in his business model. Instead, he had found a story of quiet, desperate heroism and a villain who was exploiting it for his own sick pleasure. He spent the next few days observing with a new, heightened focus. He started to see the whole system Julian had created. It was a masterpiece of petty tyranny. Julian controlled the schedule, rewarding sycophantic servers with the best shifts and punishing any dissenters with back-to-back clopins and dead tables in the back of the restaurant. He implemented a breakage fee, an arbitrary charge deducted from the entire service staff's tip pool whenever a glass or plate was broken, a fee that Arthur was certain went directly into Julian's pocket. He took credit for everything that went right and blamed his staff for everything that went wrong. He was a parasite, fattening himself on the fear and hard work of his employees. And at the center of it all was Clara, his prized possession. He gave her the best tables because she generated the most revenue. But he also seemed to take a perverse pleasure in reminding her that he was the one who allowed her that privilege. Arthur knew he had to get closer, to earn a measure of her trust. His opportunity came during a frantic Saturday night service. A food processor in the kitchen shorted out, sending a plume of acrid smoke into the air and backing up the entire kitchen. Orders were delayed, guests were getting restless, and the atmosphere was electric with stress. In the chaos, a server carrying a tray of cocktails collided with another, sending a dozen glasses of expensive scotch and craft gin crashing to the floor right in the main service artery. Shards of glass and sticky alcohol-soaked fruit spread across the marble floor. Julian, instead of taking control, began screaming at the two servers. While he was ranting, Arthur saw Clara, who was nearby, instinctively kneel down to start picking up the larger pieces of glass. "Leave it!" Julian shrieked at her. "Let the busboy handle it. You have tables waiting." Arthur was already moving. He grabbed a broom and dustpan from the service closet. "I've got it," he said, his voice calm and firm, cutting through Julian's tirade. He knelt beside Clara. "Go. I'll handle this." She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. In this place, no one ever helped anyone else. They just tried to avoid the manager's wrath. She hesitated. "Go on," he insisted, already sweeping up the glass. "He's right. Your tables need you." She gave him a small, grateful nod and disappeared. He cleaned up the mess efficiently, ignoring the glare Julian was shooting at his back. He had defied the hierarchy. He had shown solidarity. It was a small act, But in the toxic ecosystem of the Gilded Cage, it was a rebellion. The shift ended late, well after 2 a.m. Arthur was in the locker room, changing out of his stained uniform, when Clara approached him. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. "For tonight. You didn't have to do that." "No one should have to work in a place like this," he replied, looking at her directly. "He's a bully." She flinched slightly at the word, as if giving it a name made it too real. "He's difficult." "He's a thief," Arthur said, his voice low but intense. "What he does with your tips, with the breakage fees, that's not management. That's extortion." She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture. "Look, Art, I appreciate what you did, but you need to be careful. You're new. You don't know how things work here." "Then tell me," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Help me understand." She stared at him for a long moment, a silent debate raging in her eyes. He wasn't a threat. He was older, world-weary, and for some reason, he had taken her side. The dam of her carefully constructed reserve finally began to crack. "Come on," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll show you." She led him not out the staff exit, but through the now empty, cavernous dining room. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows that made the gilded fixtures look like skeletons. The opulence felt hollow, theatrical. She stopped at a table in the corner, the best one in the house, with a panoramic view of the city lights. "This was my grandfather's favorite table," she said softly, tracing the rim of a water glass left on the table. "He was a designer, an architect. He helped design some of the original interiors for this hotel back in the 70s. Arthur was stunned. He knew the firm. They were legends in their time. "He and my grandmother used to come here for their anniversary every year," Clara continued, her voice thick with memory. "He would sit here and sketch on the napkins, redesigns, little improvements. He'd say, 'A beautiful room is never finished, Clara. It's a living thing.' He taught me how to see, not just to look." She reached into her worn canvas tote bag and pulled out a small black sketchbook. She opened it on the table. Arthur leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. The pages were filled with exquisite, detailed drawings. There were sketches of new lighting fixtures, elegant and modern, that would cast a warmer glow. There were new layouts for the dining room, creating more intimate spaces without sacrificing capacity. She had redesigned the clunky, old-fashioned menus, creating a sleek, minimalist design with a new, elegant logo for the Gilded Cage. She had even sketched new uniform designs for the staff, more comfortable and stylish. It wasn't amateur doodling. It was the work of a gifted, intuitive designer. She had a natural understanding of space, light, and flow. Her ideas were brilliant, a perfect fusion of the restaurant's classic elegance with a much-needed modern sensibility. They were, in many ways, better than the multi-million-dollar proposals sitting on his desk back in his office. "This is incredible, Clara," he breathed, genuinely in awe. "You have a real talent." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "It's just a hobby, a way to feel close to him. He's gone now. My grandmother, she has Alzheimer's. She's in a facility, a good one. It's expensive." She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It costs almost everything I make here, and then some. My grandfather left her well provided for, but her illness has been long. The money is running out." And then came the final piece. "That's why I can't leave," she said, her voice cracking. "And it's why why he has so much power over me." She took a deep breath, as if about to confess a terrible crime. "A few years ago, there was a fire at my grandmother's house, a grease fire in the kitchen. I was there. I managed to get her out, but..." She hesitated, then slowly, deliberately, she unbuttoned the cuff of her left sleeve and pushed it up her arm. In the dim light of the restaurant, Arthur saw the scarred, mottled landscape of her skin. A massive, ugly burn scar stretched from her wrist all the way up her forearm. The skin was a patchwork of tight, discolored tissue, a permanent, physical record of a moment of terror and bravery. "The fire spread so fast," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the scar as if seeing it for the first time. "A flaming curtain fell. I had to push it aside to get to her. The doctors did what they could, but there's nerve damage. It aches all the time. Sometimes if I grip something too hard or for too long, my whole hand just seizes up. It's not reliable. Arthur stared at her arm, his mind reeling. The way she favored it, the constant, low-level pain she must be in every single shift. The reason she could never risk being fired, never risk a gap in her income. Julian knows, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He was here when I came back to work after the accident. He saw my file from HR. He knows I can't easily get another fine dining job with a potential physical liability. He knows I'm trapped, and he uses it every single day. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and sickening. Arthur Vance, the architect of this world, finally understood the full scope of the rot. It wasn't just in the balance sheets or the customer reviews. It was in the calculated exploitation of a young woman's love for her grandmother, in the weaponization of her secret pain. He had created a gilded cage, and Julian Croft was the gleeful, sadistic zookeeper. He looked from Clara's scarred arm to her brilliant, hopeful sketches, and the cold fury in his chest solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. This was no longer a corporate investigation. This was a crusade. He had come here to save his restaurant. He now knew he had to save a life first. The next 48 hours were a blur of clandestine activity. Arthur called Marcus from a burner phone he'd bought for cash, speaking in a low, urgent voice from the cramped bathroom of his rental apartment. "Forget the rebranding proposals, Marcus. We have a 5-alarm fire." He laid it all out. Julian's systemic theft, his psychological abuse of the staff, and the full, horrifying story of Clara, her grandmother, her injury, and her hidden talent. For once, Marcus was silent on the other end of the line, the sheer sordidness of the tale sinking in. "My God, Arthur," he finally said, "this is medieval. It's happening in our flagship hotel, in our signature restaurant, Marcus. It's happening on our watch," Arthur growled, "which means we're going to end it. I want a full forensic accounting team ready to move. I want every piece of digital and paper evidence we have on Julian Croft. Expense reports, payroll records, complaints, performance reviews. I want our head of security and 2 senior HR people on a plane to Philadelphia tomorrow. We're not just firing him, we're going to dismantle him." "What about the girl? Clara?" Arthur paused, the image of her sketchbook vivid in his mind. "She's the key to all of this. Not just the investigation, but the future. Marcus, I want you to discreetly find the name of the facility where her grandmother is staying. We are going to cover the cost, anonymously. We'll set up a grant through one of our charitable foundations. It'll be a meritorious caregiver award or some other corporate nonsense, but effective immediately, that financial burden is lifted from her. I want her to have the freedom to walk away even if she doesn't know it yet." "And what's your role in this takedown?" Marcus asked. "I'm the few," Arthur said. "I'm going to light it. The climax is set for Saturday night. It's the busiest night of the week, and according to the reservation book, the chief restaurant critic for the Philadelphia Chronicle is coming in for a review. Julian will be at his most stressed, his most volatile. I want him to expose himself in front of the world." He went to his shift that Friday with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just an observer, he was an instrument of impending justice. He watched Julian preening and bullying his staff in preparation for the critic's visit, and felt not anger, but a cold, clinical pity for the man. He was a king ruling a shrinking, poisoned kingdom, completely unaware that the executioner was standing right beside him, polishing the glasses. Saturday night arrived, and the air in the gilded cage was thick with a tense, theatrical energy. The dining room was packed. Julian, dressed in a bespoke suit, glided between tables, his charm turned up to its most blinding wattage. But his eyes were constantly darting, tracking every plate, every glass, every movement of his staff. The critic, a severe-looking woman with a formidable reputation, arrived at 8 o'clock and was seated at the best table in the house, Clara's station. Arthur watched as Julian gave Clara a final, hissed warning at the service station. "Not a single mistake, do you understand me? Your entire future in this restaurant depends on this review." Clara, unaware of the safety net Arthur had already woven for her, simply nodded, her face pale with pressure. The evening unfolded with agonizing precision. The first two courses unfolded with the silent, breathtaking precision of a heart surgeon's work. Clara moved through her station not as a person, but as an extension of service itself. A ghost who anticipated thirst, a whisper that cleared a finished plate. The formidable critic, a woman named Eleanor Vance, a cosmic irony not lost on Arthur, made meticulous notes, her expression unreadable but devoid of displeasure. Arthur, clearing plates from a nearby deuce, allowed a sliver of hope to penetrate his cold resolve. Perhaps the monster would remain caged tonight. Then the universe, with its penchant for cruel, mundane tragedies, intervened. A young couple, intoxicated by love and social media, lunged from their chairs for a selfie, their bodies a clumsy fulcrum of motion. They collided with Clara as she performed the delicate tableside presentation of the main course. The small silver saucepan of jus de veau, a sauce that had taken the kitchen 8 hours to perfect, tilted. It was a spill of no more than 3 ounces, a dark, fragrant tear that wept across the starched linen and blossomed into a Rorschach blot on the sleeve of Eleanor Vance's cream silk blouse. Silence. Not a gradual quiet, but a sudden, violent vacuum that sucked the sound from the room. Clara's lips parted in a silent gasp, her face a canvas of pure horror. The critic looked down at her arm as if a venomous snake had just bitten it, and Julian was there. He did not walk. He materialized, a phantom of pure rage summoned by the scent of disaster. The mask of the charming host did not slip. It shattered, revealing the snarling, panicked tyrant beneath. "You incompetent, worthless fool!" The words were a low, venomous hiss, a current of poison meant only for Clara, but bleeding out to the horrified surrounding tables. "Do you have any concept of what you have just done?" The table next to us, "It was an accident," Clara stammered, her body trembling, her professional composure atomized. "Excuses are the refuge of the inept." Julian's voice began to climb, shedding its restraint. He was no longer a manager. He was a cornered animal, spraying venom. He snatched a napkin and began dabbing frantically at the critic's sleeve, smearing the stain, making the violation permanent. To the critic, he pleaded, a manic note of self-pity creeping into his tone. "This is the caliber of staff I am forced to endure. Amateurs, children playing at service." His wild eyes, searching for a prop for his grand opera of victimhood, landed on the worn canvas tote bag Clara kept tucked behind the service station. It was an object of her private world, and he saw it as a weapon. He strode to it, seized it, and with a gesture of theatrical contempt, upended it. Her life tumbled onto the polished floor. Keys, a wallet, a half-eaten protein bar, and the small black moleskin sketchbook. He pounced on it like a vulture on a corpse. A slow, deeply cruel smile twisted his lips as he flipped it open. "And what have we here? The secret diary of a clumsy waitress?" His voice was a booming parody now, a performance for the entire silent, captive audience. He held it aloft. "An artist in our midst, ladies and gentlemen, an architect. While she ought to be concentrating on not scalding our honored guests, she is, in fact, busy redesigning my restaurant." He began to read from its pages, his voice dripping with saccharine mockery. "A more intuitive traffic flow for the service staff to prevent collisions." Oh, the irony. Redesign wall sconces for a warmer, indirect lighting scheme? How utterly pathetic. Humiliation, stark and absolute, washed over Clara. It was a physical force, pressing the air from her lungs, bringing a hot, blinding pressure behind her eyes. Her private hopes, the sacred connection to her grandfather, were being vivisected and mocked in the center of this gilded cage. She was frozen, a statue of misery. Julian, high on the drug of his own power, took a final, fateful step toward her. "You think you can do better than this? You, with your childish scribbles and your—" He reached out, his hand a claw, and grabbed her left arm, intending to haul her from the floor like a sack of garbage. "Get out of my sight. You're fired." His fingers, tight with rage, closed over the scarred, tender geography of her forearm. A sound tore from Clara's throat. It was not a word, but a pure elemental cry of pain, so sharp and piercing it seemed to crack the very air. Her knees buckled. The force of Julian's grip, A violation in itself had yanked her sleeve halfway up her arm, exposing the brutal, mottled landscape of the burn scar to the dim, elegant light. The critic gasped audibly. The selfie couple stared, their faces pale with horror. The performance had become something real, something ugly and violent. And then a new voice sliced through the tension. It was not loud. It was quiet, measured, and carried the chilling, absolute weight of a glacier calving into the sea. "Get your hand off her." Every head in the restaurant turned. The voice had come from the old busboy, the one they called Art. He was standing by his cart of dirty dishes. He placed a stack of heavy ceramic plates down, not with a clatter, but with a low, deliberate thud that resonated like a gavel. He then straightened his back. The defeated slump, the weary curve of his spine that had defined him, simply vanished. He rose to his full height, his posture instantly, impossibly, radiating a core of power that seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room. He looked at Julian Croft, not with the fearful eyes of a subordinate, but with the cold, unblinking gaze of a man about to foreclose on a soul. Julian stared, his rage momentarily short-circuited by confusion. "What did you say to me?" he sneered, recovering. "Get back to your dishes, old man, before you find yourself out on the street with her." Arthur took one slow, deliberate step forward, then another. He moved with a grace that belied the cheap, non-slip shoes on his feet. He reached up with his left hand and undid the top button of his drab gray uniform shirt, a gesture as casual and final as a king unsheathing a sword. "You're right about one thing, Julian," he said, his voice the calm eye of the storm. "She is an artist. She is an architect. And her childish scribbles, as you so eloquently put it, contain more vision, more integrity, and more value to this company than your entire parasitic career." He stopped less than a foot from the stunned manager, forcing Julian to tilt his head back slightly to meet his gaze. The shift in dominance was palpable, a physical rewriting of the room's hierarchy. "My name," he said, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into a silent pool, "is Arthur Vance. I own this hotel. I own this restaurant. I own the very floor you are standing on. And as of this precise second, you are no longer an employee of my company." The name detonated in the room. A shockwave of whispers, gasps, and frantic recognition swept from table to table. Vance. Arthur Vance. Julian's face cycled through a kaleidoscope of colors, from puce to ashen to a ghastly mottled white. His jaw worked, but no sound emerged. His mind, so adept at petty calculations and cruelties, had slammed into a reality it could not process. He looked from Arthur's impossibly familiar, yet utterly alien face to the critic. Eleanor Vance, a distant cousin he had never met, but whose name he now understood with dawning terror. To the horrified guests, and finally to Clara, who was staring at Arthur as if he were a ghost who had just stepped out of the wall. Arthur did not raise his voice. He had no need. The silence was his amplifier. "I built this place, this entire company, on a single unwavering principle: excellence, born of respect. You took that principle and you twisted it into a cudgel. You turned this dining room into your personal fiefdom, a cesspool of fear and systemic greed. You tormented your staff. You skimmed their tips. You stole their wages under the guise of breakage fees. And you," he turned his gaze to Clara, and his voice, though still quiet, filled with a profound, aching respect. "You took this young woman, a woman of staggering talent, unwavering courage, and a dedication that shames every executive in my company, myself included, and you discovered her secret pain, her deepest vulnerability, and you weaponized it for your own sadistic sport." He looked past Julian then, his eyes finding three individuals who now stood from their respective, strategically placed seats. Two large men in dark, conservative suits who had been nursing club sodas at the bar, and a sharp-eyed woman who had been dining alone near the entrance. Marcus Thorne, his COO, the head of Vance Hospitality Security, and the senior vice president of Human Resources. They had been his silent witnesses, his jury. "Marcus," Arthur said, his voice shifting back to the familiar, commanding tone of the boardroom, Please escort Mr. Croft off the premises. The forensic accounting team has been in his office for the last hour. I want their full report on my desk by Monday morning. And please have our legal counsel inform the Philadelphia Police Department that we will be pursuing charges of embezzlement, extortion, and felony theft. Vigorously, Julian Croft seemed to deflate. The bespoke suit, a moment ago a symbol of his authority, now hung on him like a cheap costume on a broken marionette. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. All the venom, all the bluster had been drained from him, leaving only a hollow shell. He allowed the head of security to take his arm and lead him away, a silent, ignominious exit from the kingdom he had so briefly and so brutally ruled. A thick, electric silence descended once more. Arthur Vance, the billionaire busboy, turned to face the room. He looked at the critic, Eleanor, who was staring at him, her professional poise warring with familial astonishment. "My sincerest apologies for the theatricality of the evening," he said, a ghost of a wry smile touching his lips. "Vance Hospitality has always prided itself on providing an unparalleled experience. Tonight you have certainly had one, though not, I admit, the one we advertise. We have had a catastrophic failure of management, a failure for which I and I alone take full and absolute personal responsibility." His eyes swept over the room, but they were seeking out the faces in the shadows, the servers frozen by their stations, the kitchen staff peering through the swinging doors, Sal the bartender, who was slowly, reverently polishing a single glass. He was speaking to them. Then he turned to Clara. She remained by the table, a survivor on the shore of a shipwreck, cradling her injured arm, her face a maelstrom of shock, confusion, and a fragile, terrified hope. He walked to her, his movements gentle. He knelt, the billionaire founder of a global empire kneeling on the floor, and carefully gathered the scattered contents of her life, placing her keys and wallet back in her bag. Finally, he picked up the sketchbook. He stood and handed it back to her, not as a curiosity, but as one would return a sacred text. His voice was low, for her ears only. "The phone call you are going to receive on Monday is not a dream. It will be from the Vance Charitable Foundation. They will inform you that an anonymous benefactor has established a lifetime grant to cover the full ongoing cost of your grandmother's care at her current facility. It was arranged 2 days ago. That specific burden, Clara, is gone forever." The tears that had been held back by shock and fear finally fell. They were not the hot tears of humiliation, but a silent, cleansing flood of overwhelming, crushing relief that made her body tremble. "But why?" she whispered, her voice raw. Who are you?" "I'm the man who should have known," he said, and the shame in his voice was genuine, humbling, and stripped of all artifice. "I'm the man who built a beautiful machine and became so obsessed with its performance that I forgot to listen to the cries of the people trapped in its gears. I got lost in the spreadsheets, Clara. I forgot the soul of the thing. You reminded me." He paused, his gaze dropping to the sketchbook in her hands. "You, with your courage, with this book, you are the soul of it." She looked from his face to the book, a flicker of suspicion crossing her features. "You knew about this? About my grandmother?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Yes, I had my people look into it. It was an invasion of your privacy, and I won't pretend it wasn't. It was a necessary sin to undo a greater one. I had to understand the leverage he had on you. I had to sever it before I could act." He looked back at the room, at the gilded fixtures and the plush carpets, and then his eyes returned to her, shining now with a new, invigorated purpose. "This is not the end of your career in this restaurant," he said, his voice rising, clear and resonant, a proclamation for all to hear. "This is the beginning. I have seen your vision for this place. I have read your notes, and I want to build it. With you." He saw the confusion in her eyes and clarified, leaving no room for doubt. "Starting next week, you are no longer a waitress. You'll be working directly with me and my executive design team, on full salary with a signing bonus to account for years of stolen wages. We are going to close the Gilded Cage for 3 months, and when it reopens, It will be the restaurant that you designed. From the lighting to the layout to the name on the new menu you sketched. It will be your vision. You will lead this project. The offer, so audacious, so utterly impossible, hung in the charged air. It was a fairy tale, a fantasy, and Clara's life had taught her to be deeply suspicious of both. She stared at him, her lips parted, the tears still wet on her cheeks, struggling to reconcile the man who had cleared her plates an hour ago with the man now offering her the world. Arthur saw the doubt. He gave her a small, patient smile. "Your grandfather was right, Clara," he said softly. "A beautiful room is a living thing. This one has been suffocating. It's been waiting for you, for someone who could see it to teach it how to breathe again." A slow, radiant smile, the first truly unguarded, joyful smile he had ever seen from her, finally broke through the storm on her face. It was not the simple smile of acceptance. It was the complex, luminous smile of someone who has walked through fire and just realized they can fly. It lit her tired eyes and seemed to mend the broken pieces of the room around her. "Yes," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but clear and strong, filled with a hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. "Yes, I'd like that very much." 3 weeks later, the gilded cage was a skeleton. The plush carpets were gone, rolled up and sent to a charity auction. The heavy, oppressive draperies had been torn down, allowing the stark afternoon sunlight to flood the room for the first time in decades, revealing a fine layer of dust on everything. The tables and chairs were stacked in a corner, shrouded in white cloths like a congregation of ghosts. Clara stood in the center of the cavernous space. She was not wearing a uniform. She was in jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, and sturdy work boots. Her hair was not in a severe bun, but fell loosely around her shoulders. In her hands, she held not a tray, but a roll of architectural blueprints. The black sketchbook was tucked into the back pocket of her jeans. She looked for the first time entirely like herself. Arthur Vance stood by the service entrance, leaning against the doorframe, a mug of coffee in his hands. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks. He was not directing, not commanding. He was observing. He had made the introductions, set the budget, a figure that had made his CFO blanch, and then he had stepped back. He had given her the power, and now he was watching to see what she would do with it. She ran a hand over the cool, scarred skin of her left forearm, a gesture no longer of pain, but of thought. He had seen the reports. The nerve damage was permanent, but with the financial stress gone, she had seen a specialist who had given her a regimen of therapies that were already mitigating the chronic pain. The scar was a part of her story, but it was no longer the entirety of it. "The bar," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty room. She turned to him, her eyes bright with vision. "It has to move. It blocks the flow. It creates a bottleneck right here." She paced out a line on the dusty floor. "If we move it to the far wall, open this all up, the energy will circulate. People will be able to see the view from the moment they walk in. The plumbing and electrical will be a nightmare," Arthur noted, a playful challenge in his voice. "My grandfather always said that the bones of a building tell you what's possible," she countered, a confident smile playing on her lips. "The bones of this one are good. They just need a surgeon, not a mortician." He laughed, a genuine, easy sound he hadn't made in years. The rot was gone. Not just Julian Croft, but the deeper rot within himself. The complacency, the detachment, the sin of viewing people as assets on a balance sheet. He had come down from his tower to fix a crack in his foundation and had discovered the whole structure needed to be rebuilt, not with steel and glass, but with empathy and trust. He looked around the stripped, dusty room, a space that would have given him an anxiety attack a month ago, and felt a profound sense of peace. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't looking at a decaying asset. He was looking at a genesis. He had found his new cornerstone, not in a building or a brand, but in a quiet hero with a scarred arm and a sketchbook full of light. And in giving her the keys to his gilded cage, he had finally, after 62 years, unlocked his own.